stop scrolling. If you're receiving Social Security, SSI, SSDI, or VA benefits, the next 60 seconds could change everything you thought you knew about your payments. The Supreme Court is about to make a decision that could completely upend the Social Security Administration's ability to make changes to your benefits, and millions of Americans have no idea this is happening right now. Here's what's at stake. A landmark case is challenging whether the SSA has overstepped its authority in implementing recent policy changes. If the Supreme Court sides with the challengers, we could see a massive rollback of new regulations affecting cost of living adjustments, eligibility requirements, and payment processing timelines. We're talking about real money, your money, potentially hanging in the balance. But here's what nobody's talking about. This isn't just about one court decision. This case could set a precedent that affects how benefits are administered for decades to come.
Starting right
Whether
here
you're currently receiving
and
benefits,
right now,
about to apply, or planning for your retirement, this impacts you directly. I've spent the last 72 hours digging through court documents, talking to legal experts, and breaking down exactly what this means for your specific situation. And I'm going to walk you through every single detail. No legal jargon, just the facts you need to protect your benefits. But first, smash that like button right now if you want to stay informed about your benefits. Let's make sure this critical information reaches every single person who needs to see it. All right, let's get straight into this because time is absolutely critical right now. What we're seeing unfold at the Supreme Court level isn't something that's going to play out over years. This is happening in real time, and the implications are so far-reaching that I honestly believe this could be one of the most significant Social Security cases we've seen in the last 3 decades. And yet, if you turn on the mainstream news right now, you're probably not hearing about it. That's exactly why we need to talk about this today. Because by the time this becomes headline news, it might already
starting
be too
right
late for you
here
to take the necessary
and
steps
right
to
now,
protect yourself and
because
your
this moment is your moment. It belongs to you.
Supreme Court and why this matters so much to you personally. There's a case that has been working its way through the federal court system.
It belongs to everyone gathered here today and everyone watching
The question is this:
all across
does
America.
the Social Security Administration have the legal authority to make sweeping policy changes that affect millions of beneficiaries without going through Congress? Now, you might be thinking, well, doesn't the SSA make changes all the time? And you'd be absolutely right. But what makes this case different is the scope and the scale of the changes we're talking about, and whether these changes exceed the authority that Congress originally granted to the Social Security Administration. Here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part that directly affects your wallet. Over the past several years, the SSA has implemented a series of regulatory changes that have modified how benefits are calculated, how eligibility is determined, and how quickly payments are processed. Some of these changes were relatively minor adjustments that most people didn't even notice, but others have been substantial. We're talking about changes to the continuing disability review process, modifications to the substantial gainful activity thresholds, adjustments to how overpayments are recovered, and alterations to the appeals process that have left thousands of beneficiaries in limbo for months or even years. The challengers in this Supreme Court case are arguing that the SSA has essentially been making law rather than simply enforcing the laws that Congress passed. And if the Supreme Court agrees with them, we could see a situation where many of these regulatory changes are struck down as unconstitutional overreach. Now, you might think, okay, that sounds like it could be good news if it means rolling back some of the more restrictive policies. But here's the problem, and this is what keeps me up at night. We don't actually know which way this could cut. If the court rules that the SSA exceeded its authority, it could create absolute chaos in the system because suddenly there's uncertainty about which rules are valid and which ones aren't. Let me paint you a picture of what this could look like in practical terms. Imagine you're currently receiving SSDI benefits and you've been receiving them under the current regulatory framework. Your payment amount was calculated based on certain formulas and adjustments that the SSA put in place over the last few years. Now, if the Supreme Court says those regulations were invalid, does that mean your benefit calculation was wrong? Does it mean you're owed more money? Or could it possibly mean that your benefits were calculated too generously and you might face clawbacks? These are real questions that don't have clear answers yet, and that ambiguity is dangerous for millions of people who depend on these benefits to survive. Let's talk specifically about SSI recipients for a moment, because this group is particularly vulnerable to what's happening right now. Supplemental Security income is already the most complex and restrictive of all the Social Security programs. The resource limits haven't been updated in decades, the income exclusions are Byzantine in their complexity, and the penalty structure for even minor reporting errors can be absolutely devastating. Over the years, the SSA has issued guidance documents and policy clarifications that have helped some SSI recipients navigate this incredibly complicated system. But if the Supreme Court rules that the SSA overstepped its bounds, many of those guidance documents could suddenly become invalid. That means SSI recipients could find themselves in violation of rules they didn't even know existed because the clarifying guidance they relied on is no longer legally binding. And we haven't even touched on the VA benefits angle yet, which adds another entire layer of complexity to this situation. Many veterans receive both VA disability benefits and Social Security benefits, and the interaction between these two systems is governed by a complex web of regulations and policies. Some of these policies were created by the SSA to clarify how VA benefits should be treated when determining Social Security eligibility and payment amounts. If those SSA policies are invalidated by a Supreme Court ruling, we could see veterans caught in a bureaucratic nightmare where nobody knows exactly how their benefits should be calculated or coordinated between the two agencies. Now, I want to talk about the political dimension of this case because it's absolutely crucial to understanding what's really at stake here. This isn't just about administrative law and governmental authority in some abstract sense. This is about a fundamental debate that's been raging in Washington for years about the power of federal agencies versus the power of Congress. On one side, you have people who believe that agencies like the SSA need flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances and to interpret the laws that Congress passes in ways that make practical sense. On the other side, you have people who believe that unelected bureaucrats have accumulated way too much power and that major policy decisions should be made by elected representatives in Congress, not by agency officials. The Supreme Court has been increasingly sympathetic to that second viewpoint in recent years. We've seen case after case where the court has limited the authority of federal agencies and has required Congress to be more explicit when delegating power to the executive branch. This trend is sometimes called the revival of the non-delegation doctrine, and it's fundamentally reshaping how the federal government operates. The Social Security case we're discussing today is riding this wave, and there's a very real possibility that the court will use this case to make a strong statement about limiting agency power. But here's what I find deeply frustrating about this entire situation. While the legal scholars and the politicians debate these high-minded principles about separation of powers and constitutional authority, there are real human beings whose lives hang in the balance. I'm talking about the 70 million Americans who receive Social Security benefits. I'm talking about the 8 million people who receive SSI. I'm talking about the millions of disabled veterans who depend on VA benefits. These aren't abstract policy questions for them. This is food on the table, rent money, medical care, and basic survival. Let me share with you some of the specific areas where we could see immediate impacts if the Supreme Court rules against the SSA. First, there's the issue of continuing disability reviews. The SSA has implemented policies over the years that determine how often beneficiaries need to be reevaluated to ensure they're still disabled. These policies try to balance the need for program integrity with the reality that constant reevaluations are expensive, stressful, and often unnecessary for people with permanent conditions. If the court says the SSA didn't have the authority to create these policies, we could see one of two outcomes. Either disability reviews become much more frequent and intrusive, or they become much less frequent and the program loses credibility. Neither outcome is good. Second, we need to talk about the substantial gainful activity threshold. This is the amount of money you can earn while still being considered disabled for Social Security purposes. The SSA adjusts this amount periodically to account for inflation and changes in the economy, But if the court says the SSA lacks the authority to make these adjustments without explicit congressional approval, the threshold could become frozen at whatever level it was when Congress last acted on it. That could mean disabled people who are trying to work part-time suddenly find themselves ineligible for benefits because the threshold is too low, or conversely, that the threshold becomes so out of date that it fails to serve its intended purpose. Third, there's the overpayment recovery process. This is an area where the SSA has created detailed policies about how to recover money when beneficiaries have been paid too much. These policies include provisions for hardship waivers, payment plans, and appeals. If these policies are invalidated, beneficiaries could find themselves facing much harsher collection actions with fewer protections. Or alternatively, the entire overpayment recovery system could grind to a halt because nobody knows what rules apply anymore. I also want to address something that I know is on a lot of people's minds right now, which is the question of what you should actually do in response to this situation. And I'm going to be completely honest with you. This is a difficult question to answer because we're dealing with so much uncertainty. The Supreme Court hasn't issued its ruling yet, and even when it does, we don't know exactly what the court will say or how broad the ruling will be. But there are some practical steps you can take right now to protect yourself and to be prepared for whatever comes next. First, and most importantly, you need to document everything related to your benefits. I mean everything. Keep copies of all your award letters, all your payment stubs, all correspondence with the SSA, and all medical records that support your disability claim. If there's chaos in the system after a Supreme Court ruling, having thorough documentation could be the difference between quickly resolving problems and being stuck in bureaucratic limbo for months. Create both physical and digital copies and store them in multiple locations so you don't lose everything if something happens. Second, if you're currently in the application process or the appeals process for Social Security benefits, you need to stay on top of your case like never before. Don't assume that the normal timelines and procedures will continue to apply. Call regularly to check on the status of your case. Follow up on everything in writing. If you can afford it, consider hiring a Social Security attorney or advocate who can navigate the system on your behalf. I know that legal representation costs money, but in a situation where the rules might change overnight, having a professional on your side could save you thousands of dollars in the long run. Third, start thinking about contingency plans. I'm not trying to scare you, but you need to be realistic about the possibility that your benefits could be delayed, reduced, or temporarily interrupted while the system sorts out the implications of a Supreme Court ruling. Do you have an emergency fund? Do you have family or friends who could help you financially if needed? Are there community resources you could tap into? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary questions, given the uncertainty we're facing. Fourth, get involved politically. I know. Everyone's tired of politics, and you might feel like your voice doesn't matter. But this is exactly the kind of issue where public pressure can make a real difference. Contact your senators and representatives. Tell them how you depend on Social Security benefits and how concerned you are about the Supreme Court case. Urge them to pass legislation that would clarify the SSA's authority and protect beneficiaries regardless of how the court rules. Join advocacy organizations that fight for Social Security recipients. Show up at town halls and community meetings. Your story matters, and lawmakers need to hear it. Let me also address a question that I've been getting a lot in the comments on my recent videos, which is whether this Supreme Court case is related to the broader concerns about Social Security's long-term financial stability. The short answer is no, not directly. The Social Security trust funds face long-term funding challenges that have nothing to do with this legal case about administrative authority. However, there is an indirect connection that's worth understanding. If the Supreme Court limits the SSA's ability to make administrative changes, it could make it harder for the agency to implement whatever reforms Congress eventually passes to shore up the program's finances. In other words, this case could make solving Social Security's long-term problems even more complicated than they already are. Now, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the timeline here because timing is absolutely critical. The Supreme Court typically issues its most significant rulings in June, right before the summer recess. That means we could potentially see a decision in this case within the next few months. However, the court could also issue a narrow ruling that doesn't fully resolve the questions at stake, which would mean more litigation and more uncertainty stretching out for years. The SSA, for its part, has been relatively quiet about the case publicly, which is understandable given that they're in active litigation. But behind the scenes, you can bet they're doing contingency planning for different possible outcomes. One thing that really concerns me is how unprepared most beneficiaries are for the possibility of major changes to the system. The Social Security Administration has done a poor job of communicating with beneficiaries about this case and what it could mean for them. And the mainstream media has largely ignored the story because it's technical and complicated. That's why videos like this one are so important. We need to create awareness and help people understand what's at stake before it's too late to take protective action. I also think it's important to acknowledge that there are legitimate concerns on both sides of this legal debate. The people who are challenging the SSA's authority aren't necessarily trying to hurt beneficiaries. Many of them genuinely believe that concentrating too much power in unelected agencies is dangerous and that Congress should be making these important decisions. At the same time, the SSA's defenders have a point when they say that Congress simply can't legislate every tiny detail of how a massive program like Social Security should operate. The real question is where we draw the line between appropriate agency discretion and inappropriate agency overreach. What frustrates me most about this entire situation is how it reflects a broader breakdown in our governmental system. Congress has become increasingly dysfunctional and unable to pass legislation on controversial topics. As a result, more and more policymaking has shifted to federal agencies and to the courts. But agencies can only act within the authority that Congress gives them, and courts can only decide cases brought before them. Neither institution is designed to make comprehensive policy decisions through a democratic process. So we end up with this situation where major changes to programs that affect millions of lives are being decided through administrative rulemaking and litigation rather than through open legislative debate. The bottom line is this: regardless of how the Supreme Court rules, we need Congress to step up and do its job. We need clear legislation that defines the SSA's authority, that protects beneficiaries from arbitrary changes, and that ensures the long-term stability of Social Security programs. We need lawmakers who will prioritize the needs of beneficiaries over partisan political considerations. And we need a public that pays attention to these issues and holds elected officials accountable. So where do we go from here? The honest answer is that we wait, we watch, and we prepare. Keep checking back for updates on this case because I will be covering every development as it happens. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel and that you've got notifications turned on so you don't miss crucial information. Connect with other beneficiaries and advocates in your community so you have a support network if things get complicated. And most importantly, don't panic, but don't be complacent either. This is a serious situation that requires serious attention, but panicking doesn't help anyone. What helps is being informed, being prepared, and being ready to advocate for yourself and for others who depend on these vital benefits. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. I know this was a lot of information and some of it was pretty heavy stuff, but this is the reality we're facing right now, and I believe you deserve to know the truth about what's happening with your benefits. If you found this video helpful, please share it with anyone else who receives Social Security, SSI, SSDI, or VA benefits. The more people who understand what's at stake, the better prepared we'll all be for whatever comes next. Stay strong, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next video.